I want to talk now about what I think is one of the defining characteristics of modern China, and that's the rise of a military culture that will come to dominate politics, economics, and ultimately culture. A military persuasion. It would have struck some Westerners at the turn of the last century as an unusual thing to talk about the military in China, for it was so weak and China was assumed to be a non-military culture. Soldiering in Imperial China was not the honorable career that it was, for example, in Europe. In Imperial China, we assumed that the ladder of success went up through the civilian bureaucracy, not the military ranks. And for those who studied Chinese history, although it's obvious that not a few people over time succeeded in seizing the throne by military means, they could not hope to govern such a big territory and big population by force alone. In China, it was assumed that the forces of culture would be triumphant over the forces of arms. There's the old saying, you don't use good iron for nails and you don't use good men for soldiers. But of course, all dynasties really do need good men for soldiers, and yet they save their better men for government. So we have that classic of Chinese warfare, the Sun Tzu, which makes it plain that violence is one part of warfare, but not the preferred part. The aim of war is to subdue your opponent, to get him to comply with your will, and ideally to get him to do it without fighting at all, to induce his compliance through deception, surprise, or whatever. In any event, we have long-standing images in the West of relatively passive Chinese, surviving more by their wits than by force of arms. This was the China that many Westerners thought they encountered in the 19th century, surviving by processes of cultural seduction, for example, of the conquering Manchus, making them act, at least from Western eyes, as if they were Chinese. Or it may simply be a result of the 19th century wars, which were uniformly disastrous and inept for China. China lost the First and the Second Opium Wars in 1839 to 42, 58 to 60, humiliated by the French in the 1880s, by the Japanese in the 1890s, by the whole world in the Boxer War of 1900. We have striking images of this period of the great statesman Li Hongzhang finding that the cannonballs he was to use to defend the northern coast were filled with sand instead of gunpowder. We have this famous picture of the Empress Dowager's marble barge in the Summer Palace outside of Beijing, a palace that she built and a barge that she built to replace the Summer Palace that the Westerners had destroyed in the 1860s. She put funds that were designed to go to the Qing Navy into her marble barge, and for this she has been criticized by historians in and out of China for more than a century. In her defense, I will say that her marble barge is the only boat of the Qing Navy that the Japanese didn't sink in the War of 1894 and 1895. Well, the assumption of the Chinese as being a comparatively passive people is, however, rather problematic if you read about what Chinese were doing to each other during the 19th century. When the Taiping took Nanjing, some 40,000 Manchus were in the city, and they were all killed to the last one, either in battle or, for the most part, afterwards, by burying, stabbing, or drowning. And when the Chinese provincial armies under Zheng Guofan retook the city a decade later, it was recorded, with only slight exaggeration, that not one of the 100,000 rebels in the city was taken alive. But perhaps we need to make the distinction between a propensity to violence on the one hand and organized successful violence on the part of the state on the other. Another assumption is that China, having resisted Westernization in modern times, preserving a Chinese essence, a Chinese tea, even as one tried to emulate some of the material aspects of the West, or Yong in Chinese, trying not to be socialist in the manner that the rest of the world might understand, but to be socialist with Chinese characteristics. But the one export from the West that threatens to undo all these myths, and in many ways the most successful Western cultural export of all to China, is the success of modern militarism. Our biggest export commodity to China by far before 1950 was nothing other than arms and ammunition. In the 20th century, China became, by far, the biggest arms market on Earth, and China has had, on a continuing basis since the 1910s, the largest number of men under arms of any nation on Earth. From the 19-teens through the 1960s, China also became the most militarized, in terms of the role of the military in everyday life, society on Earth. And as the crackdown in Tiananmen Square in 1989 would show, the military and no other force would still, by the late 20th century, be the main arbiter of power in modern China. So how has this come to be, and what does it mean? I certainly don't know all the answers, but it's worth discussing them thematically.